So the next session, have we got the Open Future branding up yet? No, we haven't yet. The next session's on social media, and social media is a vehicle for progress. And so we're going to talk about the good side of social media, and we're going to talk about the not so good side of social media. Before we do, I want to connect this to our Open Future initiative, because we're branding this particular session part of the Open Future initiative. And this is a conversation we're having about sort of making the case, remaking the case for the classical liberal values that The Economist has always championed in the 21st century. And this is something we're doing throughout this year, which is our 175th anniversary. And if you go to economist.com/openfuture, you can see all of the things that we're doing in this area. But essentially, it's a conversation, and we're trying to go out and make the case for these values, figure out how they apply to new issues in the 21st century. But most importantly, we're actually trying to do more than just preach to the choir. We want to go and find people who disagree with us and challenge us and make sure that we can sort of test our ideas and our values. So this session is sort of connects to the Open Societies strand of Open Future, which has 5 strands, about the free rights of individuals, and also the Open Progress strand, which is about technology and its regulation and so forth. Anyway, to kick off, I think we have a poll, which is about the subject that we're about to discuss, and it's about the relative merits of online activism versus actual real-world activism, local activism. So please weigh in on that while we're discussing. And joining me to discuss this, we have Ben Rattray, who is the CEO of Change.org, and John Galligan, who's the Senior Director for Global Government Affairs at Microsoft. And he's wearing a Microsoft and also a LinkedIn hat, because remember, LinkedIn is part of Microsoft now. So please welcome our panelists. Okay, Ben, let's start with you and with Change.org, because the origin story of Change.org relates to the time when your brother came out, I believe. So tell us the story and how that led to the path that you're now on.
Well, I was on a very different path at the time. So I was a senior in college and planning to be an investment banker. And at the time, I went back between holidays, between semesters, and one of my brothers came out as gay, totally unexpected to me. And he said, the thing that was most powerful in my life that really changed the trajectory of what I ended up doing was that the hardest part for him about being gay wasn't seeing people that were explicitly discriminatory. It was seeing good people who refused to stand up and to speak out on the issues. He said people like me, and really called me out as his own brother, someone who just hadn't been proactive in any significant way. And it was I think a real moment and time for me of deep shame and reflection and eventually transformation. It led me to actually London for a year to reflect and think and read, and then eventually to want to get into politics and the sort of means by which how to empower other people to stand up and speak out on the issues they care about.
So you experimented with sort of a social media platform version of that, and then eventually Change.org sort of evolved into the form that it has now. Is that about right? And so it was the online petitions that were really getting people's attention.
Yeah, it is sort of a long, meandering, painful journey that has gone better.
It's called failing your way to success.
There's lots of iteration and pivots.
That's right, pivots.
Learnings. But it was the case, we launched an online platform 10 years ago, trying to connect people around issues they cared about and empower them to create communities around causes and then mobilize for collective action. And we built this sort of strong, very complicated, sophisticated edifice online and thought people would build these massive movements. And the reality is, what you tend to find online is simplicity is a feature, not a bug. It is a positive, not a negative. And so we started radically simplifying it about 5 years ago, and then there's a campaign that really transformed the company where there was a woman who was walking down the street in Cape Town, South Africa, and it's an awful story. It's just a trigger warning. She gets grabbed and thrown into a shack and raped and almost killed. And the reason is she's a lesbian woman, and the man was trying to turn her straight. This awful practice many of you may know, called corrective rape, happens quite frequently at the time in Cape Town. A friend of hers saw this and had her own partner subjected to this just 6 months before and died because of it. And Numbe is her name. She didn't know what to do. She ends up using her sister's laptop remotely in a shanty town to create a Change.org petition to stop this issue. She puts an incredibly gripping photo in the story of Millicent, this woman who had been harmed, and it goes massively viral. Hundreds of thousands of people, becomes the biggest story in South Africa that week, embarrasses the government, mobilizes many people, not just online, but then offline over a number of weeks. And eventually the government effectively apologizes and passes a national task force to investigate and claim to stop corrective rape in that country. And it was a remarkable demonstration, I think, to us, to me, about the capacity of everyday people, seemingly the most disadvantaged, structurally disempowered people, with online tools and a compelling personal story can do something extraordinary. And that really changed the company. And we've been focused on doing that kind of thing since, building simple, elegant, but scalable tools that empower people to tell stories that can spread virally and change public policy.
Okay, so what's your take on this crucial question of the relationship? Well, we have the poll question about this, the relationship between
eagerly awaiting
online and
results.
offline activism, because there's the kind of, I have to raise this, the Malcolm Gladwell question, which is that people, the clicktivism and the kind of armchair activists, they'll click on the petition or whatever, and they'll think, okay, I've done my bit now, I don't have to do anything else. And his argument was that this sort of discourages people from going out and making change in the world. What do you say to that kind of criticism?
I mean, the only problem with that argument, I guess, is the data, which is to say, the most effective, the largest offline movements that have happened in American history increasingly are happening because of online tools. They're not a divide. For example, there's 40,000 online campaigns that launch on Change.org every month. Many of them then mobilize people offline. There's a huge campaign around a Sudanese woman who's about to be put to death for killing a man she had an arranged marriage with and tried to rape her a second time. And this just took off on Change.org. It's 1 million people that joined. It is digital, it's online. But then in, I think, 8 countries, there have been offline deliveries of oftentimes sort of Sudanese or Nigerian women that have been presenting petitions in front of the different embassies globally. And that never would have happened had it not been for the online, but the offline is also material. So I think there's sort of a false divide. We think increasingly, it's understandable this is brought up for people that are less familiar with this space, but it's not especially, I think, helpful in that it's just an intimate intertwining between the two things. When people are offline, like March for Our Lives started a very large Change.org campaign. It helped them drive people offline. When they're offline, they're using their phones to go amplify the offline event. They're now connecting more to the people that join the campaign to prolong that movement over time, which would be difficult to do only offline. So this synergy, I think, is increasingly what's going to be happening. And our role, I think, is how do you build the most effective tools to enable both things? We're agnostic, both the offline mobilization and the ongoing online engagement.
Great, thank you. Well, I will come back and ask you some things about more recent campaigns in a moment, but I wanted to ask you, John, about where does, we don't think about, I don't think Microsoft in this space or LinkedIn being used in this way, but what's your take on all of this?
Yeah, first of all, let me just sort of agree with Ben. I sort of think, these things are intertwined. I mean, history has shown that protests and progress are often driven by media, whether or not it's the printing press in the 1400s, whether or not it's, Luther pinning 95 Theses to the door, of a church, right through to sort of modern day traditional media. It's always in some ways been the amplifier. I think Ben's right that it's the sustained ability for social networks as we know now to help drive that change to be hopefully a little more profound, a little more sustained. I think for us, we have a professional platform. I mean, 530 million people on LinkedIn, so it's not a small social network, but it's more a professional network.
So do you see what we would consider to be activism on that platform? Because here we are talking about, how companies in particular can affect cultural change. Is that something that you would be happy to see people, and are people pushing that on LinkedIn?
I think it's a very polite place. It started sort of where you put your CV. It's where you grew your brand in many ways. And so unless you were trying to grow your brand as an activist, you probably were a little bit more shy about using LinkedIn for that purpose. But increasingly, I think over the last few years, what we are seeing is that this war for talent, this battle for the professionals, is that not only are employees looking for, or potentially employees, looking for companies that reflect their values, you're seeing a lot of companies try to desperately find more diverse candidates as well. And I'll give you just an example. I was sort of on the list of looking at a job description for one of our team back in Asia. Actually, it's my old job back in Singapore, oddly enough. The normal boilerplate you'd have in sort of in job descriptions, and this is being put on LinkedIn elsewhere, you just have, we're an equal opportunity employer. That would sort of be this typical boilerplate, and you assumed whatever you want from those few words. Now, the boilerplate for what our equal opportunity employment sort of, let's call it, values is longer than sometimes the requirements for the job, which I think is a really big improvement. And I would just imagine companies all through this room and many outside also too are extending what they mean by that. Sort of in some ways, they're trying to put their brand on a platform like LinkedIn as much to show how diverse, how inclusive, how you can belong there, if I can repeat someone from earlier this morning. And so I think that subtly, there has been a change from even just something as a professional, polite, club like LinkedIn is, to be able to even affect change, I think, within the corporate environments, to think diversity is not just something you do within a company, it's also something you've got to promote outside, because that talent is looking for place and for values just like them.
The other thing is that as a very large company, Microsoft sort of sits on both sides of this fence, because presumably you are, as any company your scale is, sometimes on the receiving end of activism. Is that something that has happened at Microsoft, and have you had like change.org or whatever petitions aimed at you?
Not distinctly. I mean, I think a lot of the dialogue happens before you reach that level of, let's call it more public shaming or let's call it protest against a corporate, let's call it position or non-position. Sometimes it's the inertia of not taking a position, which is...
But I'm thinking, I suppose, I mean, the fact that you are at risk of bad things that make you look bad happening on social media. So we had that chatbot called Tay, didn't we, who was trained to be a racist by people on Twitter. So that is now the sort of risk that companies have to worry about on the downside.
I think, our CEO would sort of say, look, you live by your principles and your values, and they're immutable, they are eternal, they don't change. And so as long as you're living up to those values, our employees are probably our harshest critics. We have just over half the population of 120,000 people operating here in the US, most of them on our campus in Seattle. And I tell you what, like, they're our best critics in terms of keeping us honest to those values. Now, it's complex when you're operating in 180 countries around the world. But at the very center, we try to sort of maintain those values and those ethics and those principles, because otherwise everything is in some ways sort of, then everything else is up for auction. So in some ways, our values and our ethics are constantly being tested, but mostly inside the company to take a position around things that you wouldn't naturally normally associate either Microsoft with or even the tech sector. And so I think we do a lot of work here in the US to ensure that we show our values at home. So that way it allows us to, when we take those values, or make positions outside the US, that people understand that we're consistent with those.
And it's just to affirm one thing as well, that, we say, what is the capacity of companies to materially advance these issues? I mean, we see them on two levels. One is pressuring companies to pressure governments, in particular, sort of governments that have less progressive attitudes around LGBT issues. A campaign that took off on the site a few years ago, when in Uganda, in particular, sort of anti-LGBT legislation. There's a huge campaign actually in the UK pressuring Barclays to pressure the government of Uganda, because Barclays has a fairly large presence there. And I'm not privy to the information, but it was 500,000 people that joined. It was a big story in the UK. It wasn't very pleasant for Barclays, and I wouldn't be surprised if they talked to the Ugandan government because of that, which changes incentives of governments. And also to affirm what you're saying about the power of employees within their own company. The most impactful people to join and influence companies we see are their own employees. So oftentimes petitions will be started not by employees, but you can see in comments that a lot of employees are joining those campaigns. We get dramatically greater response from companies when they feel like their employees are engaged around or concerned about the sort of whether there's an alignment of the values of the company and its own behavior.
So one of the things that has come up a couple of times today is the power of personal stories. So is that the sort of, I was going to ask, what tactics work when it comes to online activism? Is that the top of the list?
I mean, it's the single most impactful. And Ndume Funda, the story, I mean, nobody woke up 5 years ago and said, well, I really want to fight corrective rape in South Africa. It just didn't occur to most people. It's not that they wouldn't support it, but and the media is not going to cover it. It's not new. It's not especially sort of covered in the U.S. Media. But because this incredible story of Ndume Funda, this woman who herself had her own partner subjected to this, the incredible story of Millicent, it just spread like wildfire. We saw also, I think maybe one of the best illustrations of this, we see it in all issue areas, was around the Boy Scouts of America and the sort of acceptance of gay Boy Scouts. A campaign started about 3 years ago, maybe 4 years ago, where this den mother from Ohio, Jennifer Tyrell, she's got 3 adopted boys. one of her boys wants to be a Cub Scout. She says no because she's not accepted as a den leader. Her community thinks that's outrageous, accepts her as a den mother, embraces her. The National Boy Scouts finds out, kicks her out of the Boy Scouts. She starts a campaign, becomes huge. It ends up pressuring the Boy Scouts, who then affirm their anti-gay policy, which then inspires her, using her personal narrative, to start more campaigns to pressure companies to actually pull out of the Boy Scouts, and UPS and Intel and a bunch of companies pull out money. And then the really most powerful viral campaign, because of a personal story, that really pushed the Boy Scouts in large part to accept gay members for the first time in history, was because there's a 17-year-old kid, Ryan Andreessen. He's from California. He had been a Cub Scout for a Boy Scout for 12 years. He creates a tolerance wall in his middle school to stand up against bullying. They find out he's gay, they kick him out of the Boy Scouts. His mom starts a campaign, he thinks outrageous, starts it. It goes hugely viral. He's actually on Anderson Cooper, was in this area, he was on Ellen, all over the media. And what was so powerful about that is, if you ask the average American at that time, in the abstract, do you think that private nonprofit organizations should have the ability to decide who their members are based on religious motivations, let's say, like something abstract? You might get 50-50. If you ask the average person, should Ryan Andreessen, who's been to the Boy Scouts for 12 years, be kicked out just because he's gay? Most Americans are like, that's kind of ridiculous. And we see this across many issues. Immigration is a good example around Dreamers, and that is such a powerful currency. And we used to live in a world in which the currency that was most important was, could you buy lots of media? We see on a regular basis 13-year-old girls that are getting tens of millions of dollars worth of media because they have an incredible story and are spreading in the ways you couldn't actually purchase. So, yeah.
So those are success stories. There's another example recently, though, where there was a big global mobilization to call out the Russian government over the murder of LGBTQ citizens in Chechnya. And you don't expect the Russian government to be terribly responsive to this kind of pressure. But does that, surely, though, that may not work against them, but it creates networks that might work in other areas. So tell us about this growing phenomenon of transnational activism and how the internet allows that to happen more.
Such an opportunity, and something I think is so powerful and exciting. When you have the capacity for citizens around the globe to shine a light on a single issue and mobilize in a way that shames governments that oftentimes are less responsive to their own citizens than they are to international media, because they care about their own brand, they want to be invited to the United States, to different conferences, it really matters. The Russian government is challenging in this regard. They're one of the governments that probably cares least about this. In fact, it has an inverse effect sometimes when the government increases its own power because of sort of the West not appreciating its actions. And so, yeah, this campaign that had 500,000 people in Change.org around Chechnya, I don't know if it had any impact on the Russian government. What I do know is the networks of activists that started that campaign and joined in actually many countries outside of Russia or the region of Chechnya. There's actually a protest around that very campaign at the year anniversary this last weekend in Columbus Circle. And so we do see, even when campaigns don't quote unquote win, they don't feel like they're going to convince a government. They actually do oftentimes raise awareness about issues, activate people, and then build networks over time. There are also other governments. The Jamaican government recently sort of responded to a campaign that was online because of a very anti-LGBT preacher, I believe Stephen Anderson, in the United States, who was trying to go and sort of preach hate in Jamaica. So Jamaican citizens started a Change.org campaign, 40,000 people joined, a lot of negative press, and the Jamaican government rescinded his visa, maybe for other reasons as well. These are oftentimes contributing factors, but it depends on the government, and oftentimes, even when it doesn't win, it does build networks.
Okay, so this is all quite a happy kumbaya.
I'm going to get bad. What are bad
So let's
things?
talk about the bad side of this. The hate speech, the fact that this can just as often oppose or frustrate progress. John, what's your take on that, and how can we ensure we get more of the good stuff and not that kind of thing?
Well, look, I think it's the bidirectionality of social media that makes it so powerful for starters, just as Ben was describing in those stories. It also, in some ways, lowers the barriers for people to be, both proud and prejudiced. And so it's really confounding, because in some ways I think we're all witnessing. We've seen it in the area of just protecting democracy, and how social media is being weaponized to, in some ways, erode confidence in institutions, in the let's call it the even democratic processes, let alone what we've seen in some ways, it being a platform for some of the worst of behaviors in society. And that's not just prejudiced and bigoted and people who are really discriminatory. It also allows the most ignorant people to sort of also to leap to very convenient views, and that could be very young people who are sort of clearly just don't have the education, or very lazy people, intellectually lazy people who just don't want to be curious about why their views may be in some ways at odds with other parts of society. And I think the allure of us, the armchair activism, as you mentioned before, is one of our biggest struggles we're going to sort of take as a technology industry. Who is going to be the editorial board for the internet? Should there be?
Aren't all the choices bad? I mean, do we want the US government to decide what goes on the internet, or do we want Mark Zuckerberg? I mean, I'm not sure I like either of those choices.
But if you, even if you quote, Mark Zuckerberg, it's sort of, in some ways they are a platform. They're also a media company. In some ways, there are media rules that go around traditional media. There are protocols and there are ethics that come with journalism. And I think we're sort of seeing in some ways the incredible ability for the social media's reach and impact to start to ask questions. I don't necessarily think you need governments to be the editorial board for the internet or for social media, but ethics, behaviors, civility, and some of that is taught very early on. And in some ways, this is very much going to be an educational strategy as opposed to a political strategy.
Yeah, I actually am quite concerned about the impact that technology has had and can have, might have on.
On your own platform, you have presumably rules about if I start a petition that's that's basically inciting violence or something, then you take it down.
Yeah, hateful, explicitly discriminatory, inciting violence. But there's many campaigns I don't agree with, I don't support.
Right.
And I think that, more broadly speaking, unequivocally, the amount of sensationalism, provocation, confirmation bias, misinformation that's been propagated through social media is immensely dangerous. I think where I am optimistic is this is a choice. Right? One of the biggest lies of Silicon Valley is that technology is neutral. If that were the case, we wouldn't need designers. You have massive impact on the outcomes of your platform depending on how you design it. And so, for example, if you design a newsfeed that doesn't discriminate between pieces of content on a brand new website from Macedonia that was started yesterday or The Economist, and they're going to weight them equally based upon how popular that article is, well, yeah, you're going to get a lot of misinformation. If you do something like Google has done for many, many years, using sort of hyperlinks of the internet as proxies for the most relevant and the most trustworthy news sites, which is not easy, but has been done, you're going to get a very different outcome. And so I think that if our platforms, and in particular, it's just worth calling out, Facebook is just by far, an order of magnitude, even more than Twitter, I think, in many ways, important here, is I think they have the capacity to design in such a way to lead to much better social outcomes. And I don't mean better from an ideological perspective. I mean better from, if you have a platform in which there is an inverse relationship between the use of your platform and people's knowledge of the world, people have worse and worse information about the world, the more they use your platform, that's bad. And if you just set a goal that says, I want to make it the case that the more people use our platform, the more they actually understand, the less polarized they are, you then will have designers that design experiences and create user flows that encourage that kind of behavior. It doesn't mean you can manipulate it. You can't change people fundamentally, but you can help guide based on default behaviors and design ethics. And so I think there is a huge opportunity for that. I do think the company, Facebook in particular, is trying to do stuff on this, and I think the pressure from the outside consistently is helpful, and frankly, its own employees.
Yeah. And I think in some ways it's the diversity of employees who are creating the technology is going to be equally important. We spoke about that earlier today. Those who are creating these tools need to reflect the communities in which they're going to be used.
Yeah, that would help too. Okay, I think we've got time for a couple of questions. Do we have any questions from the floor? We have a question. I can see an arm at the back, but I can't see any more than the arm, I'm afraid.
What's top of mind when you try to keep in mind crossing over into censorship when it comes to some of these issues?
So I think that for online platforms, the most frustrating business, Zuckerberg talked about this a lot, he would rather the government take over and rather have some third party take over and responsibility for policing that content, in particular, not just on ranking, but removal. And frankly, it's not fun for us either. There's lots of campaigns. What we do is it's a user flagging system. We then look at that. We have a policy team. They've been trained with a lot of other teams similar at Twitter and at YouTube and others. And we do. Like, there are certain values and you make value judgments, and it's not always incredibly clear. I will say that on the spectrum of sort of openness to anything, where I would say Twitter is maybe at the extreme, and trying to be aligned with a certain set of values, we're more on that side of things. We do remove things that Twitter would never remove. And I don't run Twitter, and I think they have made some good decisions, but I think they have really radically sort of missed on this.
So I realized I should have said right at the beginning of this session that Ellie Hearns from
Twitter is coming up next.
So Black Lives Matter was unable to join us, so that explains her absence. Sorry, I didn't tell you that right at the start. Can we see the results of the poll question, please? Because you've all had a chance to think about that. The relative value that you place on online and offline activism.
Well, the one thing I would say is
here we go.
The second
So
local.
offline.
The most popular campaigns on Change.org are local.
So local
most of
and
the
online,
campaigns-
or okay.
Not to co-opt both of these. Whoa.
Okay. The other thing I think we were meant to have done is shown you the video that explains what Open Future is. So we'll end on that video, but before we do, please join me in thanking Ben Rattray and John Galligan. Thank you both so much.
For 175 years, The Economist has been doing more than reporting news. It's been championing values, promoting open societies, challenging special interests, making the case for decisions based on cold, hard facts. We set the agenda for free trade and globalization. We made the case for same-sex marriage and private space exploration. But in an age of populism, these values are in jeopardy. So we've begun Open Future, a global conversation with critics and supporters on the vital issues of today, from free trade and free speech to immigration, diversity, and technology. It's a conversation we began in 1843 when we argued against tariffs on grain, and continued with other causes like prison reform and ending slavery. We've led the debate on drug legalization and on regulating the titans of tech. Now it's time to shape the agenda for the challenges of the 21st century. A discussion we'll lead through articles, events, and online debates, in contests, films, and podcasts. It's time to renew the mission for an open future.